A neurologist named Michael Berry foresaw the coming housing Armageddon before the housing crash of 2007 and 2008. And he bet against the market in a big way. When he tried to explain the bet that he had made to other people who were Wall Street insiders, they all thought he was crazy. There's just absolutely no way that the housing market could melt down. Of course, looking back on history, we know that it in fact did, and Berry made a killing. How was it then that the people who were the insiders, who had a special knowledge of the financial system, didn't see what a neurologist, an outsider, saw in the system? Well, it seems that the people who were insiders were so invested in the system that had made them rich that they just could not shake the assumptions that came with that system. Now, in Jesus' day, we see a similar sort of situation in which the people who are the religious insiders, those who should have seen Jesus for who he was, didn't see him. But instead, it was the outsiders who saw Jesus for who he was. So let's look this morning at the story of these outsiders in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. Read with me. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern land arrived in Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we've come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and the teachers of the religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." Then Herod called a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star had first appeared. He told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too." After this interview, the wise men went on their way, and the star that they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When it was time for them to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. So let's put this story in context a little bit. It's often seen as part of the Christmas story, but actually from what we see later in the text, it happens about 2 years after Jesus' birth. The wise men, or magi as they're called in many other translations, are astrologers who probably come from Babylon, modern-day Iraq, or Persia, modern-day Iran. They study the skies to see if there is wisdom to be found. It's not all that surprising because ancient people believed that when monumentous events happened on earth, there was a reflection or a reverberation of those events in the heavens. So they arrive in Jerusalem because a sign in the heavens has showed them that a new king of the Jews has been born. And of course, if you're looking for a king, you go to the palace. And so when they go to the palace, they don't find the king. Instead, they find a pretender, a poser, an illegitimate ruler in Herod the Great. Herod was only half Jewish, and he had no blood from the original ruling family of David. He was, in fact, a Roman puppet who was also a paranoid tyrant, and he maintained his reign through fear, as we see in later stories where he kills all of the boys under 2 in Bethlehem when he realizes that the Magi don't go back to him. And so it seems that Herod, the king of the Jews, so to speak, and the religious scribes and priests in his court completely miss who Jesus is, while these pagan astrologers actually see Jesus and are able to respond appropriately to him. How is it that those on the inside didn't see, while those on the outside did see? Herod and his collaborators have a vested interest in the system, a kingdom that gives them their positions of power and privilege. Now, last week we looked at Mary's prayer, the Magnificat, in which she talks about how God brings down the princes from their thrones and exalts the humble. This idea that God discards our way of stacking up human beings as valuable or not valuable is great news if you're one of the oppressed people on the bottom. However, if you're one of those privileged people at the top, it's a threat to your well-being, to your status quo, to your kingdom. And so Herod and the religious authorities see Jesus, the Messiah, the promised king who will come and institute God's program, as a threat to their positions and their privilege. Now, of course, especially the religious authorities wouldn't see it that way. But that's not because they're not standing against God and what he's doing. It's just because we have a tremendous capacity for self-deception when our own vested interests are on the line. Now, we're all invested in a kingdom. A kingdom is the system that determines what is right and wrong, what is desirable or undesirable. It's the thing to which we devote ourselves. Jesus tells us to seek God's kingdom, where God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. But sometimes we have a vested interest in pursuing another kingdom, a kingdom that elevates our interest over other people's interests. And so when our desire to see God's kingdom on earth clashes with our desire to see our own power and privilege retained, we can often opt to pursue our own power and privilege while deceiving ourselves about the nature of what we're doing, telling ourselves that this kingdom that we are pursuing is, in fact, God's kingdom. In our kingdom, you see, we believe what is convenient and what is comfortable. The truth becomes a tool that we can change to our liking in order to justify what we are doing. In history, it happens all the time. To give you an example, in the mid-20th century, the United States cultivated an attitude as if an identity that they were God's new people, that they were the indispensable and righteous nation doing good things, and so the ends justified the means. They preached self-determination for all people and freedom while at the same time destroying nascent democratic movements in Iran and Guatemala. You see, the Americans were involved in the Cold War, and it was comforting to them. It justified their use of power and their pursuit of new markets overseas if they saw themselves as the righteous nation that could do no wrong, and their adversary, the Soviet Union, as the personification of evil. Well, after they had spent so much time cultivating this idea that they were a good and moral country, certain of their citizens clamored for liberation because they were not receiving justice. The civil rights movement that happened in the middle of the century called into question this narrative that the United States was a good and moral country. It cast shadows of moral ambiguity on what they wanted to believe was moral certainty. And so the church, which had bought into this system that America was the good and moral nation, stood against the liberation of people because to admit that they needed liberation would be to undermine their own self-conception as being God's moral kingdom. They were so invested in this idea, in this identity that they had carved out for themselves, that they were simply unable to countenance anything that called it into question. Now, I don't mean here to single out the Americans as the wrong people in the world. Not at all. This is a human characteristic. It's far enough away, and we are slightly removed culturally from the United States, far enough that it's easy for us to see where they went wrong. You see, it's always easier for the outsider to identify the places where we're being hypocrites than it is for the insider. So we can become experts at self-deception, and only the outsider sometimes becomes the person who can help us understand. In May of 2011, the United States killed Osama bin Laden. And following the announcement of bin Laden's death, many people rejoiced, including a lot of people who call themselves Christians. A couple of weeks after the event, atheist comedian Bill Maher castigated Christians for their hypocrisy, saying, "If you rejoice in revenge, torture, and war, you cannot say you're a follower of the guy who explicitly said, 'Love your enemies and do good to those who hate you.'" Now, I disagree with Bill Maher on almost everything, but I think on this particular point, he might have had a point. It's easy for us to see Christians of other traditions, from other countries, from other places, mistakes. It's much, much harder for us to see our own mistakes. And this is for one of only two possible reasons. Either, first, we've got it all figured out. Or maybe the more likely explanation is that we cannot see our own blind spots. So how do we correct for those blind spots? Well, I think one of the first things that we can do is that we can widen our circle. Instead of simply listening to the people who think like us, whose experience is like ours, we need to look at people who are outside of that experience. When I first started at seminary, I went to Wycliffe College, the Evangelical Anglican Seminary. Now, I'd like to say that my reasoning was that I had deep and profound spiritual and theological reasons to step outside of my faith tradition to go to seminary, but to be true, it was cheaper tuition. But I'm glad I did it anyways. You see, I encountered an Anglican view on theology, and I disagree with some Anglican perspectives on things. But the fact that I disagreed forced me to consider my own position and clarify what I believed. And at other places, it confronted me in places where I hadn't critically engaged with certain issues, and they actually changed my mind about some things. And so while I don't identify as an Anglican, I'm happy to have been in that conversation because I think that it made my faith richer in the process. And so I think that we can engage people who think differently than we do. Often this might come in your reading, or it might come in the people that you speak to. Maybe we need to read books by the church fathers to see an ancient perspective on faith that's very different from our own and not embedded in our culture. Maybe it means that we look to people from other cultures, maybe cultures in the less developed world. Maybe it means that we listen to voices from people whose life experience is different from ours. Maybe women or people of color. Maybe it means that we look outside of our tradition and into other Christian traditions to see if they have something to say to us. Maybe we read Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox or Reformed. The point isn't that we agree with everything that we read or everybody that we talk to, but that we have humble and teachable hearts that are willing to consider what other people have to say to us in hopes that we understand some of our own mistaken assumptions. Another place that we can get help is from non-Christians. I know this could sound scandalous, and certainly if we are seeking wisdom from non-Christians, we must be more discerning about what they're saying than if it was Christians. After all, not every critique that is put out there by non-Christians of Christians is given in good faith, and not every critique is valid, but that doesn't mean that everything they have to say on the issue isn't valid at all. So for example, Mohandas Gandhi once said, "I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." Ouch. Those are hard words to hear. But at the same time, maybe it's a helpful reminder. When we look at Jesus and see someone so loving and so kind, and then we look at ourselves and see ourselves as judgmental and entitled, maybe that helps remind us that our lives really ought to reflect the same attitude and position as Jesus. So Jesus tells us that where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. If we are invested in the kingdoms of this world and their treasures, then we will see reality in a way that justifies our pursuit of our self-interest. We will deceive ourselves in order to continue in the path that we have taken. So we must be careful that our first desire is for God's kingdom and his righteousness, not for ours, because if it is for ours, we'll pursue our own kingdom and pretend like it's God's. There are ideas and values and aspirations that we don't get from Jesus or from the Bible. We get them from our culture or from our socioeconomic interests or from our political party of choice. And so we have these ideas that we don't examine and don't think critically about. Maybe ideas like freedom is something that we need to physically fight for, or that God is pro-market capitalist, or that nuclear families are the only way that people can live in blessing. We take this set of assumptions, not from God, but from our political party or our socioeconomic background or our culture, and we uncritically assume them all to be articles of faith, to be true, because we have a powerful incentive not to question them. If you are perceived as being a part of a group, and then you question part of that group's script, you can trust that you are going to be treated not as a member of the group, but as a traitor to that group. And so you have to be ready to be mistreated if you call into question some of the dearly held values in our culture or in whatever group you belong to. It's only when we give up our commitment to the world's kingdoms, to having our own interests, that we can have the outsider's perspective necessary to see Jesus accurately. So together, let's commit to being strangers, exiles, foreigners, like these magi who have no vested interest in the kingdom of Caesar Augustus and Herod and the temple. Let's not pursue the kingdoms of this world. Let's not allow our treasure to be here. Let's allow our treasure to be Jesus. And then, and only then, will we be able to see him clearly.